are back again. Um, this is Dr. Obina Elewanya. I am one of those persons who you have always been with. I am back after the last time, the last experience that we had regarding a podcast. And in my last podcast, I mentioned that we needed to do a part two so that if you're joining us for the first time, no problem. I shall recap because this is one of those things that you don't have to miss anything in. We are talking about the science of the hallmarks of aging, which are the telltale signs that tells our body that we are aging from the very single cell that from fertilization to what we are now. And we know that it is the aging process that led to some of these diseases that we have now. If you remember in that podcast, we talked about genomic instability. Imagine your DNA being the instruction manual. Over time, it accumulates errors that eventually begin to change the way the cells come off. And we also mentioned the zipper, the tail end of the zipper that is responsible for reducing the rate at which that occur. We are going to talk about that later. And then we know that Nobel Prize of 2012 was won by the science of autophagy. So we are going to, these are the things we discussed in the last episode. So, and we mentioned proteostasis, which is the fact that our body system is managing proteins like an industrial packaging. The polypeptides are eventually wrapped into proteins, and then the proteins are folded back to exactly what they need to do to work. But however, there is sometimes discordance in that movement and that packaging that creates problems that eventually lead to processes that we now know lead to diseases. So it is that part of these hallmarks of aging that we had talked about the last time. I can't forget the excitement I had. It was a whirlwind tour because well, yeah, as when I was studying lifestyle medicine, it was that point of understanding the fundamental molecular and of course the cellular mechanisms that drive most of these hallmarks. That if you really understand them, that's when you begin to appreciate what our body is going through and what clicks, what makes our body function the way it does now, and why it changes over time to create the process that we now know as aging. And then I believe, because always say that understanding these mechanisms, the knowledge of it is the beginning of healing. When you understand it, you can appreciate when doctors are talking about things that you need to do to reverse, influence, intervene in some of these processes, especially with diseases that we now call the diseases of lifestyle or the chronic diseases, diabetes mellitus, hypertension, and the complications. And of course, things like cancer, which are a little bit different but still are because of some of the changes in this process. And then the neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's, Huntington's chorea, just mental decline in general. So I always want to bring that to the attention that it is important to pay attention to understand these processes, because just by understanding them, you now know why there are points that you can actually by yourself intervene, not needing your doctors, not needing even health specialists. Because of this understanding, you can know when to start, lifestyle modifications and changes in your habit that will eventually create an environment for a healthy living. And that's what this podcast is all about. So, in that last episode, I mentioned that by understanding these processes, we can start develop strategies, because in lifestyle medicine, when I said a lifestyle medicine, that is how most of the strategies that were used to try to counter, reverse, or revert these uh, started by this understanding. These hallmarks eventually created what is called the pillars of lifestyle medicine. We also talked about the possibility of reversing some of the epigenetic changes due to the science of epigenetics. And I was so excited introducing epigenetics. So let's talk about the mitochondria now. The powerhouse of our cell happen to be these little batteries in every cell that is called the mitochondria. We now understand that these are responsible for the energy management systems of our body. And um, you can imagine any industrial complex, any system, any house, home, that there is any change in the way the energy of the house is managed, electrical bills, if you understand that, and input of electricity and the output. The same thing with any instrument that we use these days, our phones, for instance. The amount of energy you put in, you have to use it. In fact, some phone companies will tell you to make sure you do not allow put in any more input sources until you use them up. So you can imagine what the mitochondria in our cells is doing, trying to harmonize this energy management between what we put in as fuel and what we use up as the output in terms of energy. So there is no doubt that the mitochondria becomes therefore a part of the hallmarks of aging, because as we age, these batteries, because of the enormous bombardment of toxins, of use and abuse, of things that we put, including the most important vital force, which we are going to talk about why, how much is important, that the amount in our atmosphere is limited to a particular level, and that is oxygen. That this oxygen is one of the things that eventually the mitochondria uses in triggering and coupling with all the resources of things that we take in as fuel to trigger the release of energy for the mechanisms of both the cells and our whole being in terms of our muscular movements and other things that we do. So the mitochondria is a very important component of our health, and we now understand as one of the so-called hallmarks of aging that due to this bombardment of these toxins, this use and abuse, the engines of our cells become less efficient, just like an old car sputtering and struggling to run. So this is what is called mitochondrial dysfunction. It's a very important part of the hallmarks of aging, because when the mitochondria is not working optimally, it affects everything from the energy level of our cells to the organ function. So I want us to even think about it this way. Imagine a city with a failing power grid. Everything begin to slow down from the lights. You have in the how the industrial lights to the home lights to the house, the lights that you use in on the streets, to the ones that run the supermarkets, to the one that you use for refrigeration, the one you use in the hospitals. You can understand what will happen to that city. That's exactly what begin to happen to our body as we get older with the dysfunction of the mitochondria. So, as I always have said about the fact that knowledge is the beginning of healing, if you understand this basic principle that the energy input, which is from the fuel of things that we eat, which when it coupled is coupled with the oxygen that we breathe, it sparks within these little batteries or energy circuits, sparks the production of ATP, which is the unit of energy that our body uses to work. So you now understand that by the fact that we can understand this, it is important that doctors realize that that is where we can now begin to see whether we can plug in interventions for healing and, of course, healthy living for those who do not have diseases. Thankfully, because we now understand this, The wear and tear of the mitochondria is something that we know. We now have targeted antioxidants. People talk about CoQ10 and other factors, vitamin C, and all the other factors and things that you can now use to protect these little batteries from damaging in the first place, or if they are damaged, to try to repair them. But do you know something I can tell you? I want you just listening to what I have just said about the fact that what you take in, which is in form of carbohydrate mostly, that goes to glucose, and for all the other going through the citric acid cycle, you now have the last end product of glucose. And these are what now is plugged into the mitochondria during something called oxidative phosphorylation, and then it sparks the production of energy. You can now imagine why, unsurprisingly, exercise, which is physical activity, perhaps is one of the most fantastic ways that you can keep your mitochondria firing at its optimal capacity in all cylinders. So you now see why doctors keep emphasizing on regular physical activity, because it forces these little engines to work harder, keep them in good shape, and keep them in a position where they can manage efficiently most of the things that come, the fuel that come into the cells, and the way they optimize the use of it in producing energy. So that brings me to recall a question that is welling in everybody's mind right now. I am very sure people are thinking about. So, if these cells, there is a failure in the energy management of these cells, what happens to them? Yes, there is something called cellular senescence. Because as a young medical scientist and as a young doctor, I thought of it as that the cell will die. I eventually got to know, yeah, some of the cells will die. They undergo, they just because of how bad the damage they are, they undergo what is called apoptosis. They commit suicide and die, will die, and the body will have to find a way of living. But there are some who they just die, but some of their brain, the brain, like I put it that way, their brain still have some sparks, and so they don't necessarily die. They go into a zombie-like existence. It is this zombie like existence that is called senescent cells. So, in lifestyle medicine, what we want to do is to disrupt the individual as a human body, not to get to the state where we are not completely dead and become a burden to our loved ones. Just like that. Because some people die and yet at 60 and are buried at 80. In the 20 years intervening, they become a burden to their loved ones. We're going to see what happens to the cells. Because in this, I will make an episode on that down the line. Because for the cells, what happened is that they're not quite dead, but they are not functioning properly, and they are not actually active either. So these senescent cells keep accumulating inside our body over time. And even worse, because they are no longer continually functioning, some of the things within them begin to leak out. They begin to release and secrete harmful substances that start damaging surrounding tissues and surrounding cells. Does that sound familiar? You can imagine if you have a small few apples that are, or grapes, or berries that are spoiled, you know how long it takes for it to begin to affect the entire bunch. That's exactly what happened within our cells, because when they begin to spew out and create this environment and secrete some of these harmful substances, those substances create an inflammation around these cells, a chronic low-grade inflammation. We are not talking about the inflammation that you have when you have a painful arthritis or tooth infection. These are very slow, chronic, low-grade inflammation that we now know contribute to many of the so-called age-related diseases, including some cancers. So that is one important foundation we need to understand. Most of those initial hallmarks of aging, if it gets to the critical threshold, will create the same environment. These cells will just go into senescence. And that's what over time, over years in our lives, our body begin to accumulate these deadly cells, and these cells within our body, and they create the environment for chronic inflammation over time, and then that is what will cause most of these diseases. But this is what has happened. Because of this, just this understanding, scientists have begun to really work hard, and there is now hope because they have designed people this understanding. Like I said again, healing, the knowledge that is driving healing. Scientists are developing senolytic drugs, which are drugs that will eventually either disrupt the formation of the senescent cells or destroy and mob them up, clearing them out from where they actually are as bad apples, just like cleaning out the bad apples before they begin to terribly affect the others. And early research at this point is so promising because there are now drugs that are known to impact our health significantly just by doing this. Do you know what else? Do you know what else that helped in cleaning up these cells? 2016 Nobel Prize of Medicine went to a science called autophagy. Autophagy or self-cleaning means auto, that is self, and phagus means eating. It won Nobel Prize in 2016, I think. 2016. Guess what was found to trigger autophagy in our body? Fasting, meaning staying without food over a long period of time, and or eating very low calorie diets, which we now know that the most important will be plant-based whole grain food. So you now see how some of this science is driving the understanding of some of the things you see on internet and here on internet. So we now understand why it's important for us to keep doing this podcast, because understanding the whys and the hows is fundamental to our healing. Trust me. If you understand the why and how of most of these diseases that we are all carrying as we begin to drive towards our aging, we now can, by ourselves, design processes by changing certain habits in us that can actually influence those diseases. If you already have some of these diseases, we now understand that if you can dedicate some time, and that is why lifestyle medicine experts are trained to understand why and how to intervene with specific, measurable, attainable, very, very directly influential interventions that can actually reverse some of them. It has been done. This is something that's been done across the world. So there are two hallmarks of aging that I have mentioned now. I've talked about mitochondrial dysfunction, which we just talked about a few minutes ago, and we've talked about cellular senescence. But that's not where it stops, because aging is such a complex process that we now understand there are multiple interacting factors. So let's consider what we can think about others. I mean, there are seven of them, but the last ones are what we call the integrating factors, because they are the integrating hallmarks that put all of these picture together. They bring all the other factors, all the other hallmarks together, and then that's what they how they influence the cells, and the big picture therefore are the changes that really begin to manifest in the aging phenotype, which is the manifestation of aging, the shriveling of our skin, the graying of our hair. I look at myself, I look at some of the pictures I had before, and it's so amazing to see what I've changed. I talk about it all the time. I actually, because of this understanding, I actually watched myself as I went through this process. There were points that I did very radical interventions and I saw the results as well. So it's important to know that these are very easy to slow down or even reverse. And there are people doing it across the world, which as we continue in this podcast, you're going to find out how easy. Not, it's not like it's a rocket science, just understanding the hallmarks of aging and the fundamental science. I'm trying to make it as simplistic as I can, but that's important because once you get it, all the other things we're going to be talking about in this podcast regarding lifestyle modification, lifestyle habits, under the, like I've always said, my concept of the mouth, the muscle, and the mind become really relevant. So I want you to put that as part of your consideration, and I want you to put that thought aside as we continue. So the first one in the so-called integrated factors is a factor that is so crucial. I look at it very closely. And the same thing that I mentioned before, as a young medical student, one of the first things that turned my mind around, those of them who are my classmates will tell you, when others were going to library, I tended to go to the law library. The reason was because I wanted to know the fundamentals all the way across to the times of Socrates, the philosophical. I tried to touch everything at the time. I was so excited about why a single cell that got a half the complement from the mother and half the complement of chromosomes from the father formed one cell. And that cell began to multiply in high fidelity. So what changed? Why did one of those cells decide to become the brain? Why did another one become the liver? How did this happen to eventually modify to form the cells, even though we now understand there's something coded in the DNA that drives that in epigenetics? But that was the curiosity that I had. But at that point where it was just cells, these are cells that were pluripotential. They had the capacity to become anything. So are you beginning to get the fact? And that factor is what these cells are called the stem cells. And we now understand that stem cell exhaustion, because if we had the stem cells we had from that fertilization, we would live forever. The cancer cells, the healer cells of cancer cells have it. So they live forever, they are immortal. We now know that we have the capacity to do the same thing, but the fact is we cannot do that unless we are able to slow down this process of the exhaustion, which is the continuous depletion of the stem cells reserve that we have, because every of our organs have a little bit of stem cell reserve that it uses to heal, repair, and of course rejuvenate. But we now understand again, based on what we said before, mouth, muscle, and mind, because of all the things that we take from our lifestyle, these things deplete, and the exhaustion of these stem cells is what is now known as one of the hallmarks of aging. So stem cells are popular, of course, in information superhighway. So I need to bring them down to make it even clearer. Stem cells are our body's repair and regeneration crew. They are the ones that have the spare parts, and I mentioned they have pluripotential capacity. And it is their remnants that eventually differentiate to every cell, every organ, every tissue we have in the body. So whenever any of our body parts damage, it is these cells that invariably quickly replenish this damaged tissue or organ in the process of healing. So you can appreciate why it has to be functioning optimally if we are going to be living optimal health. If we are going to have an optimal health span, we need to keep the rate at which these cells deplete at a very low. As we continue to age again, like we mentioned earlier on, it's like you can imagine is if you use construction website or construction sites as an example in a city, if you now have fewer construction workers and fewer materials available to repair damaged city, over time what will happen to the decline in the way, the mess that it will leave in the city. So if you leave them in a good state with the right environment, they will continue rejuvenating and continue repairing. We now know some people can act. There are things that you can do to activate them and bring them to a point where you can slow down their deterioration. And we now understand that it can slow down aging in that process, and also reduce the chances of these cells becoming diseased, to go into most of the so-called diseases of lifestyle. So, and a lot of research, of course, have gone into stem cells and stem cell therapy. For those of you who look at internet, and you know that stem cell therapy has become a big deal these days. But we now know that the factors that promote them, the stem cells, hold great promise. I always keep saying that it's one of the areas I think a lot of research needs to be focused on, because it can actually hold a great promise for rejuvenation of tissues and organs, even in organ replacements in persons who lose them. The other one that, like I said again, these are integrative hallmarks. They bring all of them together. Is the way and the way our cells communicate with each other. In fact, anyone who listens to me and my social media posts, sometimes I wonder, I echo at myself. I keep mentioning the fact, my praise, and for our body's cells. There are 43 trillion of them or more than that. I still stand by my reverence of these cells. They are so smart. They are intelligent. If you get a cut on your skin and you suddenly, within one day after the cut and the blood stops, you see the cells begin to work hard to feel that, to repair it. Our cells are smart. Do you know something? Because they are coming from the same one singular cell that happens during fertilization. You remember that? They are coming from one cell. So they maintain the communication. They are still talking to each other because they are brothers and sisters. They maintain this communication between themselves. And though they are uniquely independent, the brain cells are independent, the liver cells are independent, but they still have this way because of we now understand the communication is usually endocrine, chemical, or even ionic. And we now also know that they communicate with each other. And within a tissue, they have these little walls among them with particular types of complex proteoglycans and glycoproteins and all of that they use to talk to each other and move things around by themselves. And so our cells are smart. Isn't that not intriguing? I mean, these are the things that drove me as a young doctor, that I wrote my book, The Darwinism and Creation, the Reality of God, because I could understand. I was imagining every time I'm thinking about this, reading about them, my imaginations went haywire. These cells are really whispering to each other. And of course, we now, like I talk about the mind all the time, we now know there is something there that keep whispering into them as well, which is our brain through the currency of the mind. Because our cells are constantly communicating with each other through some of these complex signaling pathways, we know endocrine, hormonal, some locally among across themselves. This communication is therefore essential for every body function that we have. But we now realize that as we age, just like everything, like I put a gutter around my house, just to help with the way the waters, after rain. It took only 2 years. I saw one little grass growing out of one of them. I say, how could grass grow? It means for the grass to grow in the gutter of the roof, it means something has blocked that part. And lo and behold, something had blocked it. Before I know it, a lot of the parts of my house started getting flooding during rain, and it begins to eat on the ceilings and all that. Now, this is what happens when those pattern of communicative pathways begin to get blocked. It begins to affect our body's function. It disrupts our body's function, and combined with the chronic inflammation like we mentioned, it would make it worse. And this chronic inflammation with the disruption in cellular communication, we think, is what breaks the emergency services of our body, and therefore our immune system begin to wear out. And that is how diabetes mellitus, cancers, hypertension, all these neurodegenerative disorders, that is how they begin to creep up. And that's why these diseases tend to creep up with age. I wrote an article in 2012. It was either 2012 or 2013. And the title of my article at the time, I wrote it just intuitively. I asked, is aging really the disease? Is the aging the disease, or is it that the disease causes aging? I realized it was something very difficult for me to. I still see a couple of persons write little things on them these days. People are still thinking about it. Is the aging process the disease? Because we now know that it is at the core of most of these chronic disorders. So therapeutic intervention strategies like anti-inflammatory drugs that we use, importantly, lifestyle modifications such as stress reduction. Now we're going to talk about the rule of the mind. And remember, we talked about the oxygen in the mitochondria. Stress reduction is one of the things we're going to talk about. One of those areas that is never, ever mentioned by doctors sometimes. They throw it at you, or they don't even understand the role it plays. And I believe we are going to unbundle that in this podcast. So to maintain your lifestyle, to avoid these disorders, you need to have Stress reduction as one important part of it, while you're maintaining healthy diet and of course exercise through your muscles to restore healthy communication between the cells. So the mouth, muscle, and mind is exactly what you need in terms of when we are going to go into specifics. We're going to talk about them. So now Cortez and his friends, when they expounded the hallmarks long ago, this was perhaps I think in the 1980s, 79. I think they wrote the first article, and then it became popular in the 80s. They made them. It's a few of them, about 6 or 7 hallmarks of aging. We've listed about 7 of them. There was a sigh of relief in the scientific community because at that time, I remember reading about the theories of aging when I was younger. We read about the theories of aging. These were oxidative, whatever, species, reactive oxygen species, all sorts of things. At that time, there was just, among the scientific community, there was this confusion about what is actually responsible for aging. So when Cortez came with these hallmarks, it kind of created a little bit of a direction. It harmonized, the at least looking at the various so-called theories of aging and brought them together. However, there were still pieces of things that were missing, and based on the conceptual framework, there were additional hallmarks that we thought scientists had thought contribute to aging that were not in that original. And so one of them is what is called disabled microautophagy. We already talked about autophagy, right? And autophagy, we think, is what cleanses the cells, especially the senescent cells, during the time, and what triggers it we now know is fasting over a period of time. It was already built into our body by through we are going to talk about that. So if you disable that, especially the macroautophagy, then you are now going to what will happen to the cells in the house as they constantly generate waste, even the ones that are not the senescent cells. Now this is involving the non-senescent cells that are still producing waste that cannot be removed. And so autophagy is actually the cellular cleanup crew that removes damaged proteins, for instance, damaged organelles. When you have a cut and most of the damaged cells are trapped inside. If you have a hematoma, that's blood bleeding inside and it doesn't bleed out. We now know that over time you see that blood being taken away from. That's what autophagy does. There is a cleanup. And as I mentioned earlier with senescence, this process was intrinsically built into our circadian rhythm to occur when we sleep. Did I say that? While we sleep. You now understand why another pillar of lifestyle medicine is important, adequate sleep, but we're not going to waste time on that now. So while we are sleeping, that period of time when we lay down, when the sun goes down and the photons from the sun is reduced, and of course our pineal gland stimulates the release of melatonin and it brings us to lay down to rest. We are not really supposed to wake up again until the sun begins to go up. It's approximately 10 to 12 hours, and this melatonin level begin to go down because the level of photons in the atmosphere begin to rise, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus picks it up and then causes melatonin to be converted to serotonin. Now we know the mechanisms involved. So this circadian rhythm occur while we are sleeping, and when it happens, it is when the cleanup process in our body goes into action. But as we get older and older, this cleanup process that disable this macroautophagy that occurs while we are sleeping is disabled because there is a reduction in the trigger of the mechanisms that create that. And because we are not getting enough sleep and we are not fasting long enough. So you can understand why, as we are aging, this cleanup process becomes less efficient, and so it leads to building up of cellular junk. And it is not like it's like the whole city, nobody's going around taking up the trash for weeks, and everything gets messy and every system gets dysfunctional. And that is why enhancing the autophagic principles, I can close my eyes and let you know what really happens. There is a system through mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin, and of course we know these are twins, and of course the MPK systems. These are systems that are now known to be triggered by autophagy that will now eventually, that will trigger by fasting, that will now go and create the environment for autophagy. So if you do not allow these processes to happen, to be triggered, then you are likely going to end up having these problems that we are talking about. So you now see why intermittent fasting, though some doctors tend to don't want to agree to what it does. I told them they've not read the science properly. If you go and read the science of autophagy, that won Nobel Prize of Medicine and Physiology in 2016, then you will understand internet. Not the way, not the megaphone of people who want to get numbers on internet, but people who are really talking about it from a fundamental scientific background. Nobody knows how long you need to fast. Nobody knows exactly, but we know what is likely to be the threshold, and that's what it matters. And we also know one of the factors is it doesn't necessarily have to be absolute fasting. Just reducing your calories to a point where those mechanisms are triggered is important. So we now get it very clearly that it is very vital everybody. Sorry, there was a little bit interruption in the system. We are still trying to get a hang on what is going on here, but there was a little interruption in the system, but we have fixed that, and I was just saying that it is these interventional mechanisms like autophagy that we now understand brings about those things that we know that clean our body, and the fundamentals are so clear that by continuously taking very low calorie diet, which of course has to be plant-based diet. We are going to talk about epigenetic mechanisms that makes it very, very imperative that you should make it plant-based and not processed by ultra-processed fat. We now know that it is the ultra-processing of this food that increase the load and the surge that eventually become toxic to the mitochondria. We are going to talk about that individually later. But it is putting all these hallmarks together that we now understand that there are therapeutic interventions that you, as my listener, can, when you understand these mechanisms, I call it redesigning your health. You can begin to know where you can plug in to make the changes that you require, that is required to at least disrupt some of these mechanisms and slow some of them down, and then so that you can get your health back. We've already mentioned chronic inflammation, and it is worth emphasizing over and over again. It is a silent power driver for aging. I can tell you that. It's like a smothering fire because all of them come on it, and it is causing slow damage throughout your body. So there are now anti-inflammatory diets which are rich in fruits that have phytoproteins that reduce this chronic inflammation. And that is one of the things I will tell you, that if you can start these lifestyle modifications, you can see that almost all those lifestyle or so-called hallmarks of aging, you can influence them by just modifying your diet. So can anybody fault the fact that each of these points, if you can find 3 or 4 of them, and as I researched, I realized that the mechanisms and the factors that you can use to disrupt this are the same. And that's why I designed the concept of mouth, muscle, and mind, which if you go to my websites, a couple of websites, obiking.org, or all my websites, you will find some of those, everything that we talk about how to be healthy and how to maintain your health, how to disrupt these chronic diseases involved just a set of lifestyle habits that involve the mouth, the muscle, and the mind. And finally, let me talk about one that is all over the internet. Everybody talks. It's one of our newest members of in the hallmarks of aging, and that is our gut biology. It is called gut dysbiosis because it is just disruption in the biological framework, the biology of the gut. I tend to tell people that the gut, unlike I was one of those who didn't understand the role of the gut until very recently, the last 10 years or so. Our gut is home to trillions of bacteria collectively known as gut microbiota. And this complex ecosystem plays a huge role in our overall health more than anybody can imagine, influencing everything from our immune system to our brain health. In fact, I now think it is actually the third brain. The second brain is the heart. So when people say I'm talking because of the feeling in my gut. So people took it lightly, but it we now understand that the brain, one of the parts, the brain communicates constantly with the microbiota. And when this microbiota is disrupted, which happens most of the time from all the things we are pushing and pulling into it over time, the balance in this bacteria becomes disrupted and it leads to what is called dysbiosis. It is this imbalance now that contributes to the same inflammation, low-grade inflammation. It also weakens our immunity and create other health problems that we now know is part of the hallmarks of aging. So that's why dietary interventions, because the gut is all about what comes in, can restore a healthy microbiome. We are going to address most of these down the line in our podcast. So we've covered a lot of ground today looking at the intricate web of the processes that contribute to aging, my friends. But the good news is that by understanding these hallmarks, we can develop strategies to slow it down. We can do that by ourselves. Not that's why my aim is for you to become your own health coach, to know the way you will redesign your own health based on your very, very unique conditions, very socio-economic, socio-cultural environment, that you are the only one that knows it. Your doctor do not, they just want to write a prescription. We want you to know these fundamentals and know how to modify some of your health habits that will influence them. And so these strategies are what falls into the few categories of lifestyle medicine and lifestyle interventions, like regular exercise, a balanced, mostly plant-based diet, stress management, adequate sleep, and there are pharmacological approaches, like we will talk about this mechanistic target of rapamycin. Rapamycin is known, people is now proven to make people live longer. There are others I will not mention here because sometimes if you do it, creates a little bit of it. The molecule like metformin. These are showing promise. And in another science that I want to encourage people to look at is regenerative medicine, that is now including stem cell therapies, tissue engineering that we now understand, and some type of personalized medicine, which I want to practice because it tells us the intervention based on your individual genetic and metabolic profile. And I will talk with you face to face, talk with you, disturb and understand most of the factors that create the environment for you to be where you are now, and then work with you as we go forward. Um, the study of aging is rapidly evolving field. By continuing to research and innovate, we can not just extend our lifespan, but more importantly, we improve the health span, which is the life in the years, not the years of life. And so it will allow us to live longer and healthier, and it will make us live more fulfilling lives. That's the aim, my aim in this podcast, my friends. So I want you to join me the next time, because we are now going to be exploring some of the places, some of the science behind some of the interventions that you can use. And these are the things that we're going to talk about in the next time. That one is going to be brief. It's not going to be so long because I'm just going to give you, based on what you now understand about the hallmarks of aging, we now tell you some of the factors, some of the broad strokes that you can use to intervene. And then we will now begin to take it one after the other with each episode. And I may, at that time, begin to look for experts who are more grounded in some of these things, subspecialize in them, to talk with you, to bring these two together. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, I want you to stay curious, because I say again, I will say it over and over, knowledge is the beginning of healing. Knowledge is the beginning of your health. Knowledge is the beginning of wisdom. And all of it, no matter how you look at it, I want you to stay curious, because that's how you stay healthy. And thank you for being with me today. Thank you again.